Hello, everyone. This is the first of a series of review videos for the final exam. This first video will focus on Kant, what I think, you should be thinking about in terms of preparing for the final in terms of Kant. Now, as I said in class, the final exam will consist of a series of hypotheticals along the lines of the Joe and Jane and other hypotheticals that you've been faced with in this class, and you'll have to write ethical analyses of them. There'll be multiple scenarios or hypotheticals that you will have to analyze. So the entire final exam will consist of that. That is, of writing ethical analyses of various scenarios. Just to be clear on that. What that means is that as far as like looking at Kant and utilitarianism, the deeper dive that we did into those moral theories is probably not, the focus of your preparation. The focus will be applied knowledge. That is, how to actually analyze something from the point of view of Kant, how to actually analyze something from the point of view of utilitarianism, and also the other things that we read. There will be further videos on that. So when we look at something like Kant, one of the things I wanted to do in our deeper dive was to see how Kant's thinking had a certain logic to it, starting with the idea of a good will, moving from the idea of a good will to the idea of duty, moving from the idea of duty to the idea of the moral law, and moving from the idea of the moral law to the categorical imperatives. That was my procedure for looking at Kant. And basically what that meant was that we were starting and ending Kant with a look at the categorical imperatives. And I think that thinking about those categorical imperatives should be your preparation for the Kantian part of the final exam. That is, you will be asked to do a Kantian analysis of an ethical scenario. And what that means, essentially, is to do an analysis based upon the two categorical imperatives that we're familiar with. So having some notion of the theoretical background of the categorical imperatives is actually quite important, I think. That is, to realize that they emerge out of a certain way of looking at morality, and they are not merely these arbitrary rules that Kant comes up with, but they flow naturally from his deeper commitments in terms of what he conceives morality to be. But really, you should be thinking, most prominently, not about the theoretical background, which is always there and important, but about what the imperatives actually are and how to analyze the situation with them in mind. So I think that, we should take a look at what we looked at first, which is the basics of Kantianism, which is basically the categorical imperatives. Obviously, there are two, as you should know, and I think we do know. I mean, we're familiar with Kant. The first categorical imperative obviously has to do with universalizability, and it's here in bold. Canst thou also will that thy maxim should be a universal law? That's the question that we ask. If not, then it must be rejected. That's pretty much as far as you need to go. I mean, that's enough, right? Can you will that your maxim should be a universal law? If you can, then it's okay to do. That is, if you're asking, we ask this question, whether or not our maxim of action can be a universal law, when we have a moral question that we're trying to decide, when we're trying to decide whether or not to do something. And if our maxim of action passes this test, if we can will that it be a universal law, then we know that it would be ethically permissible to do that thing. If we cannot will that it should be a universal law, then we must reject it. And we know then that we cannot ethically do that thing. So it's a test. It's a very useful one, I think, as we've seen, for actually making a moral decision. Now, which is not to say that it's not deeply problematic, as came out in class. Now, what does that mean? Canst thou will that thy maxim should be a universal law? As we know, what that means basically is we ask whether the rule of action that we abstract from the thing whether we can will that rule of action, the maxim is what he calls it, the rule of action, whether it can be a universal law, whether we could will that everyone follow that rule of action, which is similar to saying whether we can will that everyone act according to it in the situation that we're trying to figure out. I'm hungry. I have no money. I'm starving. The only way I could possibly feed myself is by stealing from a store. I'm wondering whether I can do it. What is my rule of action? Well, things become difficult. As I said in class, the most important or the most difficult part, most important and difficult part of applying the first categorical imperative is figuring out what your rule of action is. And in any ethical analysis, that will be key, right? That is, if you're doing a Kantian ethical analysis of something, you have to apply the first categorical imperative. And to apply the first categorical imperative, you simply must make a decision about what the rule of action would be if you were to do something. And that's not easy to do, but that's absolutely essential. That is, you can't apply the first categorical imperative without doing that. So in your approach to it on the final exam, you simply must be very clear about what your decision is, about what the rule of action or maxim of action actually is. That's the first difficulty. The second is, what does it actually mean to be able to will that it be a universal law? Well, this is a very difficult aspect of Kant studies. But it's a decision that you need to make. That is, okay, I'm starving. The only way I can feed myself is to steal from a store. And I ask myself, what would my rule of action be if I were to steal? My rule of action, let's say, would be something like this. Whenever anybody is in dire need, and the only way that they can fulfill that need is through theft, then they should do so. Let's just say that's my rule of action. There's never one, right? That was very clear in class. There's never one and only one candidate for what the rule of action is. You just simply have to sort of make your decision about what the most accurate portrayal of the situation is. So say that's my rule of action. That when somebody is in dire need, and the only way that they can meet that need is through theft, that they should do so. If that's my rule of action, then I've completed the first step. And then I have to ask myself whether I can will that should be a universal law. That is, that everybody should follow that law, and that everybody therefore should act in the same way I do in similar situations. If I can will that it be a universal law, then it's ethical to do. If I cannot, then I know it's not ethical to do. Again, these are decisions that you need to make, and Kant means that you need to make them. That is, you need to decide what your rule of action is, and especially you need to decide whether it can be a universal law, whether everyone should act in the same situation. Now, what the answer to it is, that's a question. Can that maxim that I articulated be a law for everyone? Well, that's something that you need to decide for yourself, but you need to argue for. This is what I would emphasize for an exam question. You can't just sort of take it for granted that everyone will agree with you. You have to argue for it. That's incredibly key in doing a Kantian analysis. I would argue that, yes, I could will that maxim that I articulated earlier be a universal law, and here's why. Because so and so and so and so, right? So you have to argue for things. You can't just sort of assume that everyone agrees with you, or that what you say is obviously true. Or you have to argue. That's the important thing. Although there's no one right answer, either to what the maxim of action is or whether it can be willed to be universal law, you must argue for your position. That's what's important. Of course, no Kantian analysis would be complete without an application of the second categorical imperative, which rests upon the idea that each person, each rational creature, is an end in themselves, that is, has intrinsic worth, and therefore is an object of respect. So if the first categorical imperative is that our maxim of actions must be universalizable, the second categorical imperative is that we must always treat persons, rational creatures, as ends in themselves. Treat them with respect. Treat them with the dignity, or treat them in such a way that we recognize their dignity. And this very famously gets articulated as a general rule at the end: so act as to treat humanity. And that's problematic because he said that it's persons that need to be treated, but humanity's fine. So act as to treat humanity, whether in thine own person or in that of any other, in every case as an end with all, never as means only. So let's say that we shall always treat persons always as ends in themselves and never as means only. So taken as a practical rule, which is what the categorical imperative is, it's something that, like the first version, that we ask ourselves, I mean to do this or that, but I'm not sure if it's ethical. So I ask myself this question: would my action actually conform to this rule? And the rule is that I must always treat other persons and myself always as an end in themselves, never as a mere means to one of my ends. Also not difficult, also not easy to interpret, as obviously our class discussion. Not easy, but we have to make certain decisions. And what we ask ourselves is that in whatever I propose to do, would I be using a person as a means and only as a mere means to one of my ends? Or would I be treating them as an end in themselves? If it turns out that the answer to that question is I would be treating somebody as a mere means to one of my ends, then I know that the action is unethical. It's immoral. If, however, in asking this question, if I decide that no one, including myself, would be treated like a means rather than an end, then I know that it's ethically permissible. Now, what it means to treat somebody as a means rather than an end in themselves, that's, of course, quite difficult. And again, in your analysis, you can't just say, well, I'd be treating somebody as a means rather than an end in this case, so I can't do it. Okay, but you need to argue for that. You need to argue for your application of the principle and how you think the principle should be applied. So Kantian analysis is actually quite straightforward. It's the application of the two categorical imperatives. But the devil's in the details, right? It's the actual, the applying of it, which is difficult. And probably in any of the scenarios that I give you, there'll be no one obvious right answer. That's okay. You just need to choose how you think the imperatives are to be applied, but you must argue for them. That's the thing I want to emphasize, is that you must reasonably show how the principles here, the categorical imperatives, are to be applied in any particular case.